The afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of the apartment, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Emma sat on the worn carpet, her small legs tucked beneath her, surrounded by a collection of colorful dolls and stuffed animals. She was 3 years old, with dark curly hair that her mother often braided with pink ribbons. Her favorite doll, a Warn from Frozen, was clutched tightly in her small hands as she hummed a tune she'd learned from the movie. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle sound of her voice and the occasional honk from the street 7 stories below. Was in the kitchen preparing an early dinner. She chopped vegetables at the counter, glancing occasionally into the living room where she could see her daughter playing peacefully. It was moments like these that made all the struggle worth it. The long hours at work, the financial stress, the constant worry about providing enough for Emma. She'd left 3 months ago, after years of his unpredictable moods and sporadic violence. The breakup had been bitter. He disappeared for a while, and had allowed herself to hope that he'd finally moved on with his life. She'd been foolishly optimistic. Emma didn't understand much about her parents' relationship. All she knew was that Daddy wasn't at home anymore, and Mommy seemed happier when he wasn't around. She was young enough to have blocked out most of the scary moments, the raised voices echoing through the small apartment at night. Her preschool teachers said she was a bright, bubbly child, the kind of kid who made friends easily and had an infectious laugh that could light up a classroom. Nobody would have guessed at the subtle anxiety that sometimes gripped her, the way she'd occasionally flinch at loud noises. At 4:47 p.m., everything changed. The sound came first, not a knock but a violent impact against the front door. The wood shuddered in its frame. Emma's head snapped up, her humming stopping abruptly. Her dolls tumbled from her lap. In the kitchen, a knife clattered onto the counter. "Who is it?" she called out, though she already knew. There was only one person who would strike the door that way, with that particular mixture of rage and entitlement. "Open the door," his voice boomed from the hallway. "I need to see Emma." His heart began racing. Had no custody rights. She'd made sure of that during the separation. The judge had been clear about his unsupervised access. It was supposed to be arranged through proper channels, only on designated weekends, and only for 2 hours at a time. He wasn't supposed to show up unannounced at her apartment. He certainly wasn't supposed to be screaming in the hallway like he was doing now. "Go away," called back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You can't be here. We can arrange a proper visit through." The door exploded inward. Later, the police report would describe it as forced entry with extreme prejudice. The lock, which had just had installed 6 weeks ago for this exact reason, splintered under his assault. Fueled by a combination of alcohol and methamphetamine, had the strength of someone beyond reason. His eyes were wild, his jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides. Emma screamed. It was a sound that would haunt nightmares for years to come, her daughter's voice, high and terrified, calling out for her. The little girl scrambled backward, her small body finding the corner behind the television. She clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with primal fear. "Shut up," roared not at Emma but at who was rushing from the kitchen. He grabbed his ex-girlfriend by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with brutal force. "You've been keeping her from me, filling her head with lies." "Let go of me," struggled, trying to wrench her arm free. "You're drunk. You need to leave before I call the police." He didn't listen. Instead, he yanked her toward him, his other hand raising. Saw the fist coming and tried to turn away, but he was faster, stronger, driven by rage and substances that had erased whatever humanity might have existed in him. His knuckles connected with the side of her head, and pain exploded through her skull. She staggered backward, colliding with the kitchen counter. Pursued her, his voice a continuous stream of invectives and accusations. "You think you can take my daughter. You think you can erase me from her life." He grabbed a handful of her hair, pulling her head back with such violence that she cried out. Her vision blurred. Blood trickled from her nose. From her corner, Emma watched in horror. She was too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but she understood the basics. Daddy was hurting Mommy. Daddy was scary. Mommy was in pain. The world, which had seemed safe just moments ago, had become a place of violence and danger. Her small body shook with terror. She wanted to help her mother, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in that universal fear that grips children when they encounter chaos beyond their capacity to understand. Slammed against the kitchen counter, she felt her ribs collide with the hard edge. Stars burst in her vision. He was reaching back for another strike when the sound of sirens. A neighbor had called 911. The screams, the sounds of violence, the crashing had been impossible to ignore. Within 4 minutes of the initial call, 2 police officers were in the hallway. Within 5 minutes, they'd forced their way into the apartment and tackled to the ground. What followed was a blur of activity. Paramedics arrived, was examined for injuries, a broken nose, 3 cracked ribs, severe bruising, and a concussion. Emma was wrapped in a soft blanket by a kind female officer and held gently while everything was processed. Child Protective Services was called. Questions were asked. Everything was documented with the careful precision of people who understood that this scene would likely end up in court. Was arrested at the scene, bloody and defiant, still ranting about his rights as a father. He was read his Miranda rights, handcuffed and placed in the back of a police cruiser. But the real damage had already been done. In the hospital, held her daughter close, whispering apologies and reassurances. "It's okay, baby, you're safe now, Mommy's here." But Emma didn't respond the way she normally would. The bright, bubbly 3-year-old had retreated somewhere inside herself. She wouldn't speak, she wouldn't play, she barely ate. The trauma had left its mark on her small psyche. 6 months later, that trauma would be the key to everything, to justice, to healing, and to a transformation of the legal system itself. But on this day, in the hospital room, nobody knew that yet. All they knew was that a little girl had witnessed something terrible, and nobody had any idea how to help her speak about it. All they knew was that Emma had changed, perhaps forever. 6 months had passed since that terrible afternoon. The apartment had been repaired, the locks replaced, and the physical evidence of violence cleaned away. But the emotional scars remained etched into the fabric of the household like invisible ink only a trained eye could see. Emma still woke up screaming some nights, her small body rigid with nightmares she couldn't articulate. Worked with a child psychologist doctor, a kind woman who specialized in childhood trauma. Progress had been slow, incremental, and sometimes it felt like they were moving backward instead of forward. The courtroom scene loomed ahead like a dark mountain Emma would have to climb. The prosecution had been clear. Emma's testimony was crucial. His defense would argue that the attack was self-defense, that had been the aggressor, that he'd been protecting himself. Without Emma's account of what she'd witnessed, the unprovoked violence, the terror, the case could easily end in acquittal or mistrial. But how could anyone expect a traumatized 3-year-old to sit in a room full of strangers and recount her worst memories? It seemed impossible, even cruel. Detective Sarah sat in the Phoenix Police Department's conference room, her frustration evident in the way she tapped her pen against the wooden table. She'd been a detective for 17 years, and she'd seen too many cases crumble because trauma victims couldn't speak about what they'd experienced. Children were particularly vulnerable. They were easy to confuse under cross-examination, easy to make look unreliable, easy to discredit. "It's not going to work," Assistant District Attorney said, echoing the thoughts Sarah was having. "A 3-year-old on the stand. The defense will tear her apart. They'll claim she was coached, that her memories are implanted, that she's too young to understand what she witnessed." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. A dog was being led across the asphalt by an officer, a large German shepherd with a glossy black and tan coat. The dog moved with perfect obedience, each step deliberate and controlled. His name was Duke, and he'd been with the department for only 8 weeks. He'd arrived as part of a new initiative to train police dogs in animal-assisted therapy, a program that most of Sarah's colleagues had dismissed as soft police work, a waste of resources. But Sarah had been reading about animal-assisted interventions in courtrooms. She'd come across research papers from universities in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia. In those countries, specially trained court dogs had been sitting beside traumatized witnesses, particularly children, for over a decade. The data was remarkable. When a calm, trained dog was present, children's stress hormones decreased. Their ability to articulate trauma improved. They were more resistant to leading questions during cross-examination. Jurors took them more seriously. The conviction rates were significantly higher. It was radical. It was unconventional. It was exactly what Emma needed. Sarah turned away from the window and faced the table of prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officials. "What if we use Duke?" she said quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at her like she'd suggested they summon a unicorn to testify. "A dog," Judge Henderson finally spoke, her eyebrows rising. "In a courtroom, during testimony." "Not just any dog," Sarah said, moving back to the table. She pulled up a folder on her laptop and turned the screen so everyone could see. "Duke is trained in animal-assisted therapy. He's been certified by a national organization. He has the temperament, the training, and the instincts to provide emotional support to a traumatized child without being a distraction. The research shows." "Absolutely not," interrupted James Fletcher, the lead defense attorney in the case. He'd been brought in to consult with the prosecution, and his opposition was immediate. "That's theatrics. That's the prosecution trying to manipulate the jury with an emotional prop. Any decent defense attorney would have that ruled inadmissible." Sarah had anticipated this. She'd prepared for it. She'd already spoken with animal behaviorists, child psychologists, and experts in trauma response. She had studies, data, case precedents from other jurisdictions. She laid it all out methodically, her presentation building a case as strong as any criminal prosecution. By the end of the meeting, Judge Henderson was intrigued. "I'd want to evaluate this Duke," she said. "Meet the dog, assess the animal's temperament, review all the research, and it would have to be done very carefully. This is unprecedented in Arizona courtrooms." That's how Duke came into Emma's life. 2 weeks later, Detective Sarah drove to Phoenix Children's Hospital with Duke in the back seat of her vehicle. The dog was alert, ears perked, sensing that something important was about to happen. Sarah had explained the situation to Dr. Emma's therapist, who had been immediately receptive. "If it helps Emma feel safe enough to tell the truth, I'm willing to try it," the psychologist had said. The meeting was arranged in a quiet, comfortable room in the hospital's child psychology wing. The walls were painted soft blue. There were cushioned chairs, a small table with coloring supplies, and shelves filled with children's books and toys. Sat on one side of the room with Emma curled against her side. The little girl was wearing a pink dress with strawberry patterns on it. Her dark eyes were wary, alert to threats even in this safe space. Sarah entered slowly with Duke walking beside her. She kept the dog's leash loose, allowing Duke to move at his own pace. The dog understood the assignment without needing words. His training had prepared him for this exact moment. Duke didn't approach Emma directly. Instead, he lay down on the carpet about 6 feet away, making himself lower, smaller, less imposing. A large dog could seem frightening to a traumatized child. But a dog that was lying down, that wasn't making direct eye contact, that wasn't moving aggressively, that was a different story. Emma watched the dog with cautious curiosity. Slowly, so slowly that almost didn't notice, her daughter's tense shoulders began to relax slightly. "This is Duke," Sarah said softly, speaking to but knowing Emma was listening. "He's a police dog, and he's very good at helping people who had scary things happen to them." Duke didn't move. He simply lay there, breathing quietly, existing in the room without demanding anything. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Emma continued watching the dog. Sarah noticed something shifting in the little girl's demeanor, not dramatic but real. The rigid tension in her small body was easing. The fear in her eyes was receding just slightly, replaced by curiosity. Nudged Emma gently. "Do you want to pet the dog, baby?" Emma hesitated. Then, with the kind of courage that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old, she slid down from her mother's lap and took a tentative step forward. Duke's tail wagged slowly, just twice, acknowledging her bravery without overwhelming her. Emma's small hand reached out and touched Duke's fur. It was soft, warm, alive. For the first time since that terrible afternoon 6 months ago, Emma smiled. Not a forced smile, not a smile that was quickly swallowed by fear, but a genuine, pure smile that transformed her entire face. Sarah felt tears prickling the corners of her eyes. She'd seen Duke work with children before, but it never got old, never lost its power. She was watching a traumatized child begin to heal, and witnessing that transformation was privilege and responsibility combined. By the end of the session, Emma had moved from petting Duke to actually playing with him slightly, giggling when the dog's tail knocked over a tower of blocks she'd been stacking. Watched her daughter with an expression of wonder. In the span of 1 hour, Emma had changed. Not completely. The trauma was still there, waiting in the shadows, but something had shifted. There was possibility now. There was hope. As they left the hospital, Sarah looked at Duke and whispered, "You know what we're asking you to do, don't you, boy? She's counting on you." Duke looked up at her, and if dogs could understand the weight of responsibility, this one did. The courtroom would be waiting, was a lawyer who believed in 2 things, the power of money and the fallibility of the human memory. He'd been practicing criminal defense in Phoenix for 23 years, and in that time he'd built a reputation as someone who could make witnesses crumble, evidence disappear, and juries doubt their own certainty. His billable hours were astronomical. His client list read like a who's who of Phoenix's criminal underworld, and his conviction rate, remarkably low. People paid him extraordinary sums because he had a gift for exploiting loopholes in the law and vulnerabilities in prosecution cases. Had hired because he'd been recommended by a friend, someone who'd successfully avoided a 20-year sentence with legal maneuvering. Had paid a $50,000 retainer and was confident that his investment would pay dividends. After all, what judge or jury would convict him based on the testimony of a 3-year-old? On a Tuesday morning in late January, sat in his corner office on the 25th floor of the Chase Bank building downtown. Floor to ceiling, windows offered a view of Phoenix stretching out to the desert mountains beyond. His assistant had just brought him an espresso, exactly the right temperature, exactly the right strength, and he was reviewing the prosecution's discovery materials for the case. He read through the police report, he scanned the medical records, he examined the photographs, he listened to the audio recording of his initial statement to police, and then he saw it, the prosecution's witness list. Emma, age 3 years old, child witness to the alleged assault. Actually laughed out loud. It was a sound of genuine amusement that echoed through his office. His assistant, hearing it through the open door, felt a chill run down her spine. She'd learned long ago that when laughed like that, it meant someone was about to have a very bad day. He buzzed his assistant. "Get me everything we have on child testimony in Arizona," he commanded. "I want case law, precedent, psychological studies on false memories in young children, and I want it this afternoon." By 3 p.m. had assembled a comprehensive file. He read through it with the satisfaction of a chess player who's just spotted his opponent's tactical error. The research was clear. Children under 5 had notoriously unreliable memories. They were highly suggestible. They could be coached without even realizing it. Defense attorneys routinely destroyed the credibility of young witnesses with strategic questioning. It was almost too easy. He scheduled a meeting for the following day at the county detention facility. The holding area where inmates met with their attorneys was a gray, depressing space with metal tables bolted to the floor and plastic chairs on either side. Barriers separated the inmates from the free world. Guard stations monitored every interaction. Was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his demeanor cocky despite his circumstances. "How are we looking?" asked immediately, his confidence evident in his tone. Didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're looking excellent. The prosecution's case has a critical weakness, a weakness I'm going to exploit ruthlessly." "What is it?" Leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Their primary witness to the alleged assault is a 3-year-old girl," said, allowing the statement to hang in the air. "Emma, a child, a toddler. Someone whose brain is still developing, whose memory is unreliable, whose entire testimony could have been suggested to her by a vengeful mother." His face lit up. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that little girls don't remember events accurately," continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer. "I'm saying that juries instinctively distrust very young witnesses. I'm saying that with the right cross-examination, I can make her look confused, contradictory, and coached. And once I've done that, your case falls apart." He pulled out a stack of research papers, printed articles about childhood memory and suggestibility. He explained the science in clinical terms, discussing concepts like source confusion and narrative contamination. He talked about how children's memories could be shaped by leading questions, by adult expectations, by repeated tellings of a story. "The mother will have coached her," said with certainty. "She will have told Emma the story repeatedly, emphasized certain details, perhaps even inadvertently suggested details that the child then incorporates into her own memory. By the time she takes the stand, she won't be remembering the actual event. She'll be remembering what her mother told her to remember." Sat back, a smile spreading across his face. "So I'm going to walk." "Not necessarily walk," clarified, though his tone was still confident. "But the charge might be reduced. The jury might deadlock. The judge might declare a mistrial. There are multiple paths to a favorable outcome for you. But yes, I'm highly confident that the prosecution's case is fundamentally flawed." What didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his assessment was about to become irrelevant. He didn't know about Duke. He didn't know about the animal-assisted testimony protocol that Judge Henderson was currently reviewing in extraordinary detail. He didn't know that the prosecution had spent the last 6 weeks preparing Emma not just to testify, but to testify alongside a trained emotional support dog. Left the meeting feeling more optimistic than he had since his arrest. He shared his assessment with his cellmates. The 3-year-old was going to be his ticket to freedom. The joke in the holding cell was crude and ugly, reflecting the mindset of someone who believed the system was his to manipulate. Back in his office, continued reading through his research materials. He prepared a cross-examination strategy that he was confident would systematically dismantle Emma's testimony. He drafted motions questioning the child's to testify. He prepared arguments for why the jury should apply heightened skepticism to any statements made by someone so young. He was, in essence, planning to prove that Emma was too damaged, too young, too unreliable to be trusted. He would paint her as a puppet of her mother's revenge narrative, a child who couldn't possibly distinguish between what she actually remembered and what she'd been told to say. What he didn't anticipate was that Emma wasn't going to be testifying as a traumatized, isolated child. She was going to be testifying as someone who'd experienced genuine healing, someone whose nervous system had been regulated through the presence of a trained animal. Someone who'd learned that telling the truth was safe when you weren't alone. Had faced many different types of witnesses. He'd cross-examined detectives, forensic experts, grieving families, and frightened victims. But he'd never faced a 3-year-old girl with a police dog beside her, and the unique confidence that came from knowing you weren't standing alone. That Tuesday evening, as reviewed his strategy one more time, he felt supremely confident. He had no idea that his entire approach was about to become not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. He didn't realize that the presence of Duke would transform not just Emma's testimony, but the entire perception of what he was trying to do, undermine a child who'd already shown tremendous courage. He ordered room service to his office, a steak, imported wine, a chocolate mousse, and congratulated himself on a case well strategized. He was already thinking about how he'd spend the substantial fee he was about to earn when walked free. He had no idea that he was about to walk straight into the most significant failure of his legal career. Emma woke at 5:47 a.m., her body jolting upright in bed before her mind had fully engaged with consciousness. For a moment, she existed in that liminal space between sleep and waking, where nightmares and reality blurred together. Her small hands gripped the frozen blanket that covered her, pulling it up to her chin. The darkness of her bedroom felt oppressive, pressing down on her small frame with invisible weight. Was there immediately, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed and pulled her daughter close, whispering reassurances into her dark curls. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mommy's here. You're safe." Emma's heart gradually slowed from its panicked rhythm. She looked up at her mother's face, illuminated by the pale pre-dawn light filtering through the curtains. Eyes were red-rimmed. She hadn't slept well either. Emma could see it in the tension around her mother's mouth, in the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her. "Today is the day," Emma said, her 3-year-old voice small and fragile in the quiet apartment. They'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, but the abstract future had suddenly become terrifyingly concrete. "Yes, baby, today is the day," confirmed. "But remember what we talked about. You're going to tell the people what you remember about when that man came to our house, and Duke will be with you. Duke will be right there the whole time." Emma's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of Duke. In the past 6 weeks since that first meeting at the hospital, she'd seen the dog every week. Detective had even arranged for them to visit the police station once, where Emma had gotten to see where Duke worked, had touched his badge, had felt the genuine affection the officers had for the animal. Emma had started talking more, laughing more, sleeping better. Duke had become her anchor to safety. "Will Duke stay next to me?" Emma asked, her small voice uncertain. "The whole time," promised. "He won't leave your side." They lay together in the quiet of the apartment as dawn gradually transformed the darkness into shades of gray, then pink, then golden sunlight. Thought about everything that had led to this moment. The violence, the trauma, the months of uncertainty, the question that had haunted her, would Emma ever fully recover? And now this, her baby girl, about to walk into a courtroom full of strangers and speak her truth. The phone rang at 6:30 a.m. It was Detective Sarah calling to confirm the plan one last time. "How are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely cared. "I'm terrified," admitted, "but I think Emma is ready. She's been asking about Duke." "That's good," Sarah said. "Duke is ready too. I'm going to pick you both up at 8:00 a.m. We'll take him to the courthouse early. Let Emma spend some time with him in a quiet room before everything starts. The judge wants to make sure everything is set up perfectly." After hanging up began the morning routine. She helped Emma use the bathroom, washed her face with a soft washcloth, and brushed her dark curls carefully. They'd picked out Emma's outfit together the night before, a pink dress with white lace trim, not too fancy, not too casual. It was important that Emma looked like herself, not like a doll that had been dressed up for a performance. Emma picked at her breakfast, her stomach too nervous to process food. Didn't push her. She understood that anxiety could suppress appetite in children just as much as in adults. Instead, she poured a glass of juice and made sure Emma stayed hydrated. "Remember what we practiced?" asked gently as they sat at the kitchen table. Emma nodded solemnly. "I just tell what I remember. I don't have to make anything up. I just tell the truth." "That's exactly right," said. "And if you get confused or scared, you can look at Duke. Duke will help you feel brave." At 8:00 a.m. sharp, Detective Sarah arrived in an unmarked police vehicle. Duke was in the back seat, his entire body vibrating with the enthusiasm of a dog who understood that something important was about to happen. When Emma saw him through the window, her anxiety visibly lessened. She took her mother's hand and they walked to the car. The drive to the courthouse took 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, Emma sat with Duke in the back seat, her small fingers buried in his soft fur. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply held onto the dog, finding comfort in his steady presence, his warm body, his unconditional acceptance. Sarah glanced back occasionally in the mirror, her eyes lingering on the little girl and the big dog. She thought about all the research she'd read, all the arguments she'd made about why this would work. Now, watching it unfold in real time, she felt a mixture of hope and responsibility that was almost overwhelming. This little girl was trusting them to keep her safe. The legal system was trusting them to proceed in an ethical manner, and Duke was trusting his training to do what he'd been prepared to do. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded. News vans from local television stations had set up camp, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. Reporters clustered in small groups, checking their phones, reviewing notes about the case. Word had gotten out about the unusual testimony protocol, and the media was intrigued. This was a story that had legs, a human interest angle combined with legal innovation. Sarah took a different entrance, driving around to the back of the building where they could avoid the reporters. She parked in a secure area reserved for law enforcement and court personnel. She turned to, "Okay, we're going to take you to a private room where you can wait. Judge Henderson wants to see Emma and Duke together first in chambers, just to confirm everything is proceeding as planned." They walked through institutional corridors, beige walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of industrial cleaner. Emma's small hand gripped both her mother's hand and Duke's leash. To anyone observing them, the contrast was striking. A terrified 3-year-old, a protective mother, and a large police dog moving with deliberate calm, as if he was carrying something precious. In the judge's chambers, had to remain outside. Emma and Duke entered alone with Detective and Judge Henderson. The judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, but her expression softened when she saw Emma and Duke together. "Emma," Judge Henderson said gently, "I'm Judge. I need to talk to you about something very important today. Do you understand that you're going to talk about what you remember?" Emma nodded, her hand still on Duke's head. "And do you understand that it's very important to tell the truth? That even if it's scary or sad, we need to know what really happened?" "Yes," Emma said quietly. "Good girl, and Duke will be with you." "Duke helps me be brave," Emma said with simple certainty. Judge Henderson felt tears prickling her eyes. She'd been on the bench for 22 years. She'd seen thousands of cases, thousands of witnesses. But she'd never seen anything quite like this. A 3-year-old child who understood, in her own way, the importance of truth, reinforced by the presence of an animal who would help her deliver it. "I think you're going to do just fine, Emma," the judge said. She looked at Detective. "Let's proceed. We begin in 30 minutes. As they walked back to the preparation room, embraced her daughter one final time. "I love you so much, baby girl," she whispered. "Just remember, tell the truth, and Duke will be right there with you." Emma looked up at her mother, then at Duke, then straight ahead toward the hallway that led to the courtroom. She took a deep breath that seemed too big for her small body. "I'm ready," she said. And somehow, impossibly, she was. The courtroom doors were massive and imposing, carved from dark wood that had seen decades of justice and injustice, truth and lies. At 9:58 a.m., precisely 2 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, Detective Sarah walked with Emma and Duke toward those doors. Waited in the hallway, having been instructed that she could observe from the gallery but not be present as Emma. The separation felt cruel, but it was necessary. The defense would argue that was coaching Emma, that her presence would contaminate the testimony. Emma's hand gripped Duke's leather collar. The dog moved with perfect synchronization, matching the little girl's halting pace step by step. Sarah walked slightly ahead, her police uniform providing visual authority and reassurance. To anyone watching, and there were many watching from the hallway, the image was striking. A child of 3, a dog of 90 pounds, and a detective walking toward a moment that would define a case and potentially transform the legal system. The courtroom was already full. Reporters lined the back, their cameras ready. Spectators filled the gallery, legal students interested in the innovative testimony protocol, victim advocates who'd been following the case, curious citizens who'd read about it in the newspapers. The 12 jurors were seated in their box, every eye turned toward the door. Judge Henderson sat elevated on the bench, her gavel resting before her, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes alert and observing. Sat at the defense table in his court suit, looking respectable and dangerous in equal measure. His attorney was making last-minute notes on his legal pad, supremely confident in his strategy. When he saw Emma enter the courtroom with Duke, he almost smiled. The dog was exactly what he'd been hoping for, a theatrical prop, an emotional manipulation that would actually help his case by appearing to prejudice the jury toward the little girl's testimony. He had no idea how wrong he was. Emma's eyes adjusted to the bright courtroom lights. Everything seemed enormous. The high ceilings, the polished wood, the sea of adult faces all turned toward her. For a moment, panic flickered across her small features. This wasn't the hospital room or the practice space. This was real. This was the place where important things happened, where her voice would matter in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But Duke was there. The dog's steady presence grounded her. Emma looked down at his familiar head, at the badge on his collar catching the light, at the calm strength in his muscular body. Something inside her shifted. If Duke was calm, then maybe she could be calm too. Sarah guided Emma to the specially prepared witness stand, a chair that had been elevated so that the jury could see her clearly, yet positioned so that she remained at a proportionate height relative to the courtroom rather than overwhelmed by it. The chair had cushions. It was painted a soft blue. It looked, as much as possible, like a safe space in an institutional environment. Duke was positioned beside the chair, close enough to touch but not so close as to block the jury's view. The dog lay down on a soft mat that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. His leash was held by Sarah, who would remain in the courtroom but would fade into the background once the testimony began. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some questions about what you remember. It's very important that you tell me the truth. Do you understand?" "Yes," Emma said, her small voice barely carrying across the courtroom. "And if you don't understand a question, it's okay to say so. Is that all right?" "Yes." "Good girl. Now, Emma, can you tell me about the day that the man came to your house?" Prosecutor stood, moving carefully to position herself where Emma could see her without blocking the jury's line of sight. She'd rehearsed this dozens of times with Emma in the practice room. She knew exactly how to ask open-ended questions that would allow the child to tell her story without leading or suggesting. "There was a loud noise," Emma began, her 3-year-old voice filling the courtroom with a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so small. "At the door, like somebody was hitting it." The courtroom was completely silent. The reporters had stopped writing. The jurors leaned forward, even paused in his note-taking, suddenly paying full attention. "And what happened next?" asked gently. "Mommy said, 'Who is it?' And then the door, it came open. The man came in very fast. He was loud." "Was he upset?" "Yes, very upset. He was saying bad words. He was yelling." "And what did your mommy do?" "She told me to go in the closet. She said it was a game, but it wasn't a game. I was scared." Emma's voice wavered slightly, her lip trembling. For a split second thought they might lose her. But then Emma looked down at Duke, and her small hand reached out and touched the dog's head. The The contact calmed her immediately. Duke's tail wagged once, a small acknowledgement that he understood her bravery. "Can you tell me what you saw while you were in the closet?" continued. The man was pushing Mommy. He was really mean. He pushed her really hard against the counter thing. "And then what happened?" "Her face, there was red stuff, I think it was blood, I was very scared." Was suddenly on alert. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. The child's account was detailed, consistent, and utterly credible. The presence of Duke, rather than appearing theatrical, seemed to enhance her credibility. Jurors were watching the little girl with expressions of compassion and belief. "Did you see what the man looked like?" asked. "Yes." "Can you point to him in the courtroom?" This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Emma turned her small body slightly, her eyes scanning the courtroom. She found sitting at the defense table. For a moment, she simply looked at him, a 3-year-old child recognizing the man who had terrified her, who had hurt her mother, who had invaded her world with violence. And then Emma pointed her small finger directly at him. "That man," she said with absolute certainty, "that's the man." The courtroom erupted in a surge of murmurs. The judge raised her gavel in warning, and the room fell silent again. But something fundamental had shifted. Emma's identification, delivered with such undeniable clarity, had penetrated every jury member's sense of truth. Felt something inside him go cold. His strategy had been based on the assumption that a 3-year-old would be confused, easily rattled, unable to withstand cross-examination. But he was watching a child who was neither confused nor frightened. She was calm. She was articulate. She was absolutely certain. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes. Emma described the sounds, the violence, the fear. She used simple 3-year-old language, yet her account was devastatingly clear. When finally said, "Thank you, Emma, I have no more questions," the prosecutor stepped back with a small nod toward the little girl. It was recognition of extraordinary courage. Now came the test. Stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. He had prepared extensively for this moment. He had his questions ready. He had his strategy prepared. He walked toward Emma with an expression of fatherly concern, a performance designed to make him look sympathetic and the little girl look foolish. "Hello, Emma," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "My name is Mr. I'm going to ask you some questions, okay?" Emma nodded, her small hand immediately reaching for Duke's ear. "Now, when your mommy told you to go in the closet, she used the word game, didn't she?" "Yes." "So you knew she was trying to make it into a game, right? To distract you from being scared." This was a leading question designed to plant suggestion, but Emma didn't take the bait. "No, she said it was a game, but it wasn't really a game." "But how can you be sure it wasn't a game? 3-year-olds sometimes have trouble with what's real and what's pretend, don't they?" "I was scared," Emma said simply. "That's real." And there it was, a 3-year-old child, speaking from her own experience, refusing to be confused by adult manipulation. The jury watched this exchange with visible admiration for the child's clarity. Pressed forward with his questions, becoming increasingly aggressive in his attempts to discredit her. But Emma remained consistent. She didn't contradict herself. She didn't become confused. And whenever her stress levels rose, Duke was there, his presence alone enough to regulate her nervous system, to remind her that she was safe. By the time sat down, he'd failed. Not just failed to discredit her, but actually reinforced her credibility by appearing to bully a traumatized child while she remained calm and truthful. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that comes after something momentous has occurred. Returned to the defense table, his face carefully composed into a mask of professional indifference, but his hands told a different story. They trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers. His jaw was clenched. Beads of perspiration had formed on his forehead despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. He just experienced something he hadn't encountered in 23 years of criminal defense, complete and utter failure in front of a jury. Leaned over and whispered harshly, "What the hell was that? I thought you said she'd crack." Didn't respond. He couldn't. He was still processing what had happened. The little girl had been supposed to be confused, suggestible, easily rattled. Instead, she'd been articulate, consistent, and impossibly credible. Worse, she'd made him, a sophisticated attorney in an expensive suit, look like he was bullying a traumatized child. The jury had watched the interaction with what could only be described as disgust. Emma remained in the witness chair, had finished her questioning, and cross-examination was complete. By all legal standards, Emma was dismissed, but Judge Henderson made a gesture that indicated Emma should remain where she was for the moment. The judge was observing something that was about to unfold, something that no one had anticipated. As Emma sat in the witness chair, waiting to be excused, something shifted in her demeanor. The stress of the cross-examination, the effort of maintaining her composure while being questioned by an aggressive attorney, the sheer emotional weight of having against the man who'd terrified her, it all caught up with her in one sudden moment. Her small face crumpled. Her lip began to tremble. Her eyes welled with tears. She wasn't crying dramatically or making noise. Instead, she was experiencing the quiet breakdown that comes after a tremendous effort, after you've held yourself together through sheer will and finally realize you can relax your vigilance. Emma's small body slumped slightly in the chair. Her hand released its grip on Duke's collar. But Duke noticed. The dog's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Up until this point, Duke had been performing his trained role flawlessly. He'd remained calm and steady. He provided emotional support through his presence. He'd been, in essence, following his extensive training in animal-assisted therapy. But what happened next transcended training. What happened next was pure instinct, genuine empathy, and the kind of emotional intelligence that exists beyond the scope of formal instruction. Duke stood up, breaking his position beside the chair, and gently pressed his large head directly into Emma's lap. It wasn't a move from any police training manual. It wasn't something Sarah had taught him to do. It was Duke's own decision, made in response to a child he'd bonded with over weeks of careful connection. The dog's warm, muscular body leaned against Emma's legs. His ears drooped slightly. His brown eyes, when Emma looked down at him, were filled with something that could only be described as compassion. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Henderson's hand, which had been reaching for her gavel to excuse Emma, stopped midway. The journalists in the back rows gasped almost simultaneously. Jurors leaned back in their chairs, their expressions shifting from satisfied vindication to something deeper, a recognition of genuine connection and animal care. Even seemed affected. For a moment, his tough exterior cracked, and he looked away from the sight of the child and the dog, as if he couldn't bear to witness the tenderness of the moment. Emma looked down at Duke. Her small hands reached out and buried themselves in his soft fur. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his head. The dog didn't move. He simply remained there, offering his presence, his weight, his unconditional support to a little girl who just endured something extraordinarily difficult. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She'd worked extensively with Duke, had understood the dog's capabilities, had believed in the power of animal-assisted therapy. But this moment, this unprompted, genuine expression of empathy from a trained police dog, exceeded anything she'd anticipated. In the gallery, who'd been watching from her seat, buried her face in her hands. A victim advocate sitting beside her placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Everyone in the courtroom understood that they were witnessing something rare and profound. What nobody knew, what the court would later learn through interviews with animal behaviorists and veterinary psychologists, was that Duke had recognized Emma's emotional state and responded not as a trained dog following commands, but as a sensitive being responding to another being in distress. Later, When the case was analyzed by experts, one renowned animal behaviorist would write, "What we observed was evidence of genuine emotional intelligence in the animal." Duke made a choice in that moment, a choice to provide comfort in the way that would most benefit the traumatized child. That level of responsiveness suggests an animal with sophisticated emotional understanding. It took 30 seconds for the moment to fully resolve. Emma gradually stopped trembling. She continued holding Duke, breathing in the familiar scent of him, allowing his steady presence to calm her nervous system. Duke remained perfectly still, a living anchor in the midst of institutional chaos. Finally, Judge Henderson cleared her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, carried unexpected emotion. "Emma, you did a wonderful job today. You were very brave. You can leave the witness stand now, and detective will take you to see your mother." Emma nodded and slipped down from the chair. Duke immediately adjusted his position, moving with her, maintaining physical contact as they walked toward the courtroom exit. Sarah followed, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. As they left the courtroom, Emma glanced back once, her eyes finding. There was no fear in her gaze anymore, just a quiet certainty that she'd done what she needed to do. The door closed behind them. For a moment the courtroom remained silent. Then Judge Henderson spoke to the remaining parties. "We'll take a 30-minute recess. When we reconvene, we'll hear closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense." But something fundamental had changed. Every juror understood it. Every spectator felt it. Even, sitting rigidly at the defense table, comprehended that his case was lost. The jury had watched a 3-year-old child tell the truth with unwavering consistency. They'd watched an experienced defense attorney fail to shake her testimony, and they'd watched an animal respond with genuine care and empathy to a traumatized child. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Emma rushed into her mother's arms, held her daughter, kissing the top of her head repeatedly. "You did it, baby girl. You were so brave, so incredibly brave." Emma didn't respond verbally. She simply held her mother and Duke, grounded in the love and support of the two beings who understood her trauma and believed in her completely. Detective watched the reunion, her heart full and her professional conviction confirmed. This was why she'd fought for this protocol. This was why she'd believed that a traumatized child could be heard if given the right support, not through coercion or manipulation, but through genuine connection and emotional safety. Back in the courtroom, the jurors filed out during recess. They didn't discuss the case. They were instructed not to, but their body language spoke volumes. They walked with the certainty of people who'd seen truth and recognized it. Remained at the defense table, staring at nothing. His 23 years of criminal defense, his reputation for exploiting weaknesses in prosecution cases, his supreme confidence in his ability to discredit witnesses, all of it had been undone by a 3-year-old girl and a police dog. He looked over at and saw his client's face going gray. Finally understood what it meant to face someone who couldn't be intimidated, confused, or manipulated. He finally understood that his victim had found her voice, and that voice, supported by courage and love and the unexpected partnership between a child and an animal, was more powerful than any legal strategy he could deploy. The 30-minute recess ticked away. When the jury reconvened and closing arguments began, everyone in the courtroom already knew how this would end. The testimony had concluded. The truth had been spoken. Now it was simply a matter of the legal process catching up with the reality that everyone had witnessed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. In a case of this magnitude, one involving violence, a child witness, and testimony that would define legal precedent, the brevity of the deliberation was itself a statement. Normally, juries agonized over details, debated interpretation, struggled with the weight of their responsibility. 3 hours and 47 minutes suggested a level of certainty that was almost unusual. Judge Henderson sat in her chambers reviewing case law and making notes. She knew what the verdict would be. She'd seen it in the jurors' faces as they filed out of the courtroom. They'd watched Emma testify. They'd seen her maintain consistency under aggressive cross-examination. They'd witnessed Duke's unprompted moment of compassion, and they'd reached the same conclusion that everyone else in the courtroom had reached. The defendant was guilty. In the courthouse hallway, Emma sat together on a wooden bench, with Duke resting his head on Emma's lap. The little girl had finally eaten a small sandwich, her appetite returning now that the testimony was complete. She was coloring in a book that detective had provided, her small hands moving deliberately over the pages, creating her own narrative of images and colors. Watched her daughter and felt something shift inside her chest. For 6 months, she'd carried the burden of this case alone. She'd worried about Emma's trauma, about the impossibility of getting justice, about how this experience would shape her daughter's future. Now, as she watched Emma color, a simple, normal activity that a 3-year-old should be doing, felt a weight lifting. Stood in the defense conference room with. The atmosphere was completely different from their earlier meetings. Gone was the confidence, the certainty, the arrogance. Instead, there was only resignation. "The jury is going to convict," said flatly. He'd seen enough juries to read the signs. "I'm going to recommend we prepare for sentencing. There's nothing left to argue." His face went pale. For the first time since his arrest, the reality of his situation became concrete and unavoidable. He'd believed promises. He'd counted on the attorney's assurances that a 3-year-old's testimony couldn't be trusted. He'd miscalculated the power of a child who refused to be silenced, who maintained her truth despite intimidation, who was supported by something he hadn't anticipated: genuine care. "How long?" asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Depends on what they charge," said, reviewing his notes without emotion. "Breaking and entering, assault, aggravated assault. We're looking at a minimum of 8 to 10 years, realistically. Could be longer depending on the judge's sentencing guidelines and her discretion." Put his head in his hands. His expensive legal defense had cost him $50,000, and it had been worth nothing. A 3-year-old girl in a pink dress had demolished his freedom with her simple truth. At 2:34 p.m., the jury foreman sent word that they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Spectators who'd been waiting in the hallway rushed back in. Reporters positioned themselves strategically. The energy in the room was electric. Everyone understood they were about to witness a moment that would reverberate through legal circles. Emma was brought back into the courtroom by detective. She sat in the gallery with her mother, Duke positioned between them. The little girl didn't fully understand what was about to happen, but she understood that it was important. She gripped Duke's collar and looked up at her mother. "It's almost over, baby," whispered. "After this, we can go home." The judge entered and everyone stood. The jury filed in and Emma watched their faces. What she saw, what everyone could read in their expressions, was absolute certainty about guilt. The bailiff read the charges: breaking and entering in the 1st degree, assault in the 2nd degree, aggravated assault in the 1st degree. For each charge, the foreman delivered the same verdict: guilty. 3 guilty verdicts, no hesitation, no ambiguity. The courtroom erupted in a controlled but unmistakable wave of emotion. His hand flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Emma didn't fully comprehend what had happened, but she understood that her mother was experiencing relief rather than fear. She reached over and patted his arm gently, a small gesture of comfort from a 3-year-old attempting to reassure her mother. Duke's tail wagged slowly, as if the dog understood that justice had been served. His face crumpled. His attorney placed a hand on his arm but shook it off. He'd come to court confident in his superiority, convinced that the legal system would bend to his will. He'd been proven devastatingly wrong by a child he'd underestimated, by a system that had been willing to innovate to protect vulnerable witnesses, and by his own arrogance. Judge Henderson raised her gavel. "The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. which will be scheduled for 3 weeks from today. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down, with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. As the bailiff approached to take into custody, something unexpected happened. Emma, watching from the gallery, suddenly turned her head away. She didn't want to see him. She didn't want to watch his removal from the courtroom. Instead, she buried her face in Duke's neck, allowing the dog to shield her from the sight of the man who'd hurt her mother. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She'd told her truth, she'd faced her fear, and now she could choose not to look at him anymore. Over the following days, as the legal proceedings concluded and was formally sentenced to 10 years in prison, something extraordinary began to happen. News outlets ran the trial footage repeatedly. Legal experts began analyzing what had occurred. Child psychologists praised Emma's composure and the court's innovative approach. Animal behaviorists published papers about Duke's unprompted display of empathy. The image of the little girl and the dog became iconic, featured on news broadcasts, in legal journals, in social media posts. People who had nothing to do with the case began sharing the story because it represented something fundamental about human nature: the possibility of healing, the power of support systems, the triumph of truth over manipulation. Law schools began discussing the case in their coursework. Clinical psychology programs analyzed the testimony from a trauma perspective. Animal science departments studied Duke's behavior. It became the case that people referenced when discussing how to help vulnerable witnesses. Within 6 months, victim advocacy groups were calling for legislative change. Arizona's Governor Sandra Johnson received thousands of letters from constituents asking for formal recognition of the animal-assisted testimony protocol. News articles compared the case to landmark civil rights decisions, suggesting that Emma's testimony had the potential to transform how the justice system treated child witnesses. And through it all, Emma slowly healed. The nightmares decreased. She began playing again with genuine joy rather than anxious distraction. She returned to preschool and was noted by her teachers as being a bright, articulate, empathetic child who seemed to understand the importance of telling the truth. In the police department, Duke received official commendations. Detective Sarah was promoted to captain and asked to oversee the expansion of the animal-assisted testimony protocol throughout Arizona law enforcement. The dog that was once considered a soft addition to police work became a cornerstone of victim protection and justice. But perhaps the most significant change was invisible. It wasn't documented in legislation or recorded in courtroom transcripts. It was internal. Emma had learned that her voice mattered, that telling the truth, even when it was terrifying, could create change, that she was not powerless, not insignificant, and not alone. She'd also learned that sometimes help comes from unexpected sources, from a detective who believed in innovation, from a judge willing to take a chance, from a dog that understood compassion without being taught it, and from a mother who fought tirelessly to protect her. 3 years later, when was released from prison after his sentence was reduced through an appellate process, Emma was a confident 6-year-old who barely remembered her fear. She was in 1st grade, making friends, learning to read, growing into a person who understood the power of her own voice. And Duke continued his work with countless other traumatized children, each one finding what Emma had found: the courage to speak their truth, supported by unconditional presence and genuine care. The verdict had been guilty on all counts, but the real victory belonged to a little girl who'd refused to be silenced, a dog who'd refused to be just a tool, and a justice system that had finally listened. The Arizona State Capitol building gleamed in the afternoon sunlight on a warm March day, 18 months after Emma's testimony. The marble columns cast long shadows across the steps where politicians, journalists, and advocates had gathered for a historic moment. Inside the governor's office, Sandra Johnson sat at her desk, reviewing the legislation that was about to become law. The Emma's Voice Act, would fundamentally transform how Arizona's court system handled child witnesses and establish a framework for animal-assisted testimony protocols throughout the state. Emma sat in the front row of chairs arranged for the signing ceremony, wearing a pale pink dress with white ribbons in her dark curls. She was now 5 years old, though she seemed older. There was a quiet wisdom in her eyes that came from having survived something most children never face. Beside her sat Detective Sarah, now captain, her dress uniform immaculate, her expression proud. And beside them both lay Duke, his graying muzzle evidence of his years of service, his badge polished to a shine that caught the light. Held her daughter's hand as Governor Johnson made her opening remarks. Today, we recognize that our legal system must evolve to protect our most vulnerable citizens, our children, the governor said, her voice carrying through the office. We're here to honor a brave little girl who taught us that truth, when given proper support, cannot be silenced. Emma looked up at her mother, not fully comprehending the magnitude of the moment, but understanding that something important was happening. She reached down and touched Duke's head, finding comfort in the familiar contact. The governor continued, "The Emma's Voice Act will establish funding for trained court support dogs in all Arizona courtrooms. It will provide legal protections for child witnesses using this protocol, and it will serve as a model for other states seeking to reform their own systems. This legislation is named after Emma, a brave 3-year-old who refused to be intimidated, who spoke her truth, and who, in doing so, changed our system of justice for the better." As the governor approached the desk to sign the legislation, Emma was invited to come stand beside her. The little girl walked up nervously, her small hand still gripping Duke's collar. The governor knelt down to Emma's level, her expression warm and genuine. "Thank you, Emma," Governor Johnson said. "Thank you for being so brave. Thank you for helping us understand that all voices matter, no matter how small." Emma nodded solemnly, uncertain of what to say. Then, with the innocent wisdom of a child, she simply said, "Duke helped me." The governor smiled, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, he did, and that's why Duke is here today too. Both of you deserve this honor." The pen came down and the governor's signature was affixed to the legislation. Cameras flashed. Reporters called out questions, but Emma didn't notice. She was focused on Duke, on her mother, on the people who'd supported her through the most difficult experience of her young life. Over the following weeks, the legislation moved into implementation. $5 million in state funding was allocated to train animal-assisted court dogs. A certification program was established at Arizona State University, training both dogs and handlers in the specialized skills required. Within 2 years, trained court support dogs would be available in every major courthouse in Arizona. But the impact extended far beyond Arizona's borders. Legal journals published detailed analyses of Emma's case. The trial footage, with Emma's identifying information redacted to protect her privacy, became a teaching tool in law schools and victim advocacy programs. Within 18 months of the legislation's passage, 12 other states had enacted similar laws based on Arizona's model. In the police department, Detective, now Captain Sarah, oversaw the training program with meticulous care. She'd become nationally recognized as an expert in animal-assisted testimony. Universities invited her to lecture. Legal conferences featured her as a keynote speaker. But what mattered most to her was the work itself. The children she trained with, the dogs that worked alongside them, the justice that was served because vulnerable witnesses could now be heard clearly. Duke continued his work for another 3 years, working with over 200 traumatized children. Each one found what Emma had found: the courage to speak their truth, the safety to be vulnerable, the strength to face their past. But eventually, even the strongest among us must slow down. At age 12, Duke was retired from active courtroom duty, though he remained a beloved fixture at the police station. Emma, meanwhile, grew. She entered kindergarten, then first grade, then second grade. She was a bright, articulate, empathetic child who seemed to understand instinctively the importance of truth-telling and the power of speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Her teachers noted her unusual maturity and compassion. By third grade, she was serving as a peer counselor, helping other children work through their conflicts and fears. 5 years after the original trial, when Emma was 8 years old, she was invited back to the courthouse for the official dedication of the new Child Witness Support Center, a facility specifically designed for traumatized young witnesses, featuring trained court dogs, comfortable waiting areas, and therapeutic spaces designed to help children prepare for testimony. On the day of the dedication, Emma walked through the center with her mother, Captain, and a now-retired Duke. The dog moved slowly, his joints stiffer with age, but his spirit remained strong. When they reached the main courtroom support area, Emma saw a bronze plaque on the wall. It read, "The Duke and Emma Protocol, dedicated to the courage of Emma and the compassion of Duke, whose partnership transformed the Arizona justice system and demonstrated that vulnerable witnesses, when properly supported, possess the power to speak truth and create change. This facility is dedicated to all children who have found their voice through animal-assisted testimony." Emma stood before the plaque, reading her own name alongside Duke's. She reached down and hugged the dog, and for a moment she was no longer an 8-year-old girl. She was a 3-year-old child again, terrified but trying to be brave, finding comfort in Duke's steady presence. "I'm proud of you," Captain whispered, placing a supportive hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma looked up at her. "I'm proud of Duke," she said simply. "He helped me tell the truth." That evening, Emma and her family were invited to a private dinner with Governor Johnson, Captain, and several other officials who'd been involved in the legislation and protocol development. As they sat around the table, the governor asked Emma what she wanted to be when she grew up. Emma thought carefully before answering. "I want to help people who are scared," she said, "like Duke helped me." "Have you thought about becoming a police officer?" the governor asked. "Or a lawyer, or maybe working with animals in some capacity?" Emma considered this. "Maybe I could do all of those things," she said with the confident optimism of a child who'd learned that impossible things could become possible with courage and support. Looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and wonder. This was the child who, 6 months before her 4th birthday, had been traumatized into silence. Now she was talking about her future with purpose and intention, shaped by her experience but not limited by it. 20 years later, Dr. Emma sat in her office at the University of Arizona, where she'd earned her doctorate in animal-assisted therapy and forensic psychology. Her research focused on the intersection of trauma recovery and animal-human bonding. She'd written extensively about her own case, transforming her personal experience into academic knowledge that helped thousands of other traumatized children. On her office wall hung a photograph of her as a 3-year-old girl standing beside a large German shepherd, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of perfect trust. The caption read, "Emma and Duke, 2015, the beginning of a revolution in justice." Duke had passed away at age 17, surrounded by Captain and Emma's family, honored as the police dog who changed the course of justice in America. His legacy lived on in hundreds of trained animals working in courtrooms across the country, each one helping vulnerable witnesses find their voice. Emma often reflected on that moment in the courtroom, the moment when she'd pointed and said those 2 words. She'd been so small, so terrified, yet somehow capable of extraordinary courage. She'd learned that size didn't determine significance, that age didn't limit voice, and that sometimes unexpected partnerships could create the most powerful transformations. As she worked with traumatized children and trained new animal-assisted therapy specialists, Emma carried Duke's lesson forward. That vulnerability and strength could coexist, that compassion transcended species, and that one small child, properly supported, could create change that rippled outward to transform entire systems. The girl who'd once hidden in a closet, terrified and silent, had become a voice for countless others. And it had all begun with a dog, a little girl, and the simple truth that sometimes we all need someone or something to help us find the courage to speak.